I think what's really interesting to me about this place is that none of us belong in neat little boxes. Everyone who's gotten up here said they hated school and that they don't fit neatly into a category, and I'd say that's true about myself. At any rate, I ended up in design school because I really believed that designers had the power, not politicians. From the beginning, the very, very beginning of life, I can remember being much more interested in messages than anything else. And as a designer, people kept saying, going back to design school, you were never interested in design. I was always interested in the way things came together in the form and what it represented. It's no surprise then that in starting Diamond and Green, Michael and I made a dedicated effort not to ever do anything twice. It's made keeping a business going a little difficult, but it's made our lives a lot of fun. What we became very early enamored with were exhibitions. In fact, a lot of the people we work with aren't in design at all. They come from theater and rock concerts and film and video, multi-image. They design lighting and special effects, and this all comes together. What is more and more important, I think, for us as designers to be aware of is that one needs strong and well-directed ideas or all these people run amok, that the technology isn't the end in itself, but the means to help us integrate form and content. One of the things that within this genre of thematic and art exhibits that you should be aware of is that they're found in lots of different places these days. Besides World's Fairs, which are historic, museums and galleries, since the 60s, a lot of corporations do them. I started thinking about something else which has always interested in me in all media, which is that media are a product of their time. I know it sounds very corny, but we think of that certainly with film, and in the Walker Show on graphic design in America that just opened in New York again at IBM, looking at that, you see work from the early part of the century that's fresher than the stuff you see today. But at the same time, it is true that images come out of a place and a time and culture. I'm very interested in how you translate this to exhibition design. Print is simpler than exhibits. Buildings which react to their times are actually not totally directly meant to communicate. Film shares the aspect with exhibits of taking place over time. Theater employs many of the same visual techniques, but exhibits are different. Exhibits are different because people have choice. They're like interactive, in a sense. They are interactive. And they're the ultimate interactive in that you don't have to pay attention. You can walk through and not look. You can walk through and look at half of what you're seeing. And as our audiences become more sophisticated, more visually literate, even if not more verbally literate, they demand a higher level of participation and freedom than ever before. They have lots of choices. It's commonly believed that the beginning of modern exhibitions really comes out of the Middle Ages, and I really found this very interesting, miracle morality plays. These performances were truly spectacular. We really probably haven't come up with much that surpasses it. They demanded vast numbers of properties and working machinery. There were raised wooden platforms that concealed traps. There were cranes by which God and his angels would descend from heaven. In the Mons play of 1501, there was a mechanism of a hell mouth that really made me green with envy. I wish I had designed it. It opened to belch out clouds of smoke. It closed to swallow the damned. It was so complicated it took 17 men to operate it, and the stage carpenters thought nothing of producing floods, fires, and earthquakes. Disney, eat your heart out. It was the first World's Fairs that led to the first thematic exhibits that we see more and more of today. There are two great fairs I want to talk to, and that's 1939 in New York and 1964 in New York. I want to talk about them a little bit because I want to make an observation later about perception. It is really interesting how the times colored the events and how the events themselves were and weren't in sync with the times. They were each a barometer of the mood. They each embraced technology completely. They each presented new visions to the public. They each boasted the latest of everything. They were each incredibly spectacular. And relevant to what we're speaking about today, they all brought the latest and the best to people. And while the forms and images, they're both in New York, the fact is that they were very, very different, and profoundly and subtly so. And it's by their comparison that I think there's an interesting point to be made. Robert Stern wrote in his book, 1930 New York, the real genius of the exhibitors of the fair, this is 1930, was that they understood that the machine was no longer central. It's the first time. They understood that in a consumer-oriented society, that people ended up more fascinated with process than with machines. When people asked about the fair, they would usually say that there was something magical about it. They would talk about the crowd and the continuous movement of huge numbers of people, always zigzagging toward Futurama. And what's really interesting about the fair, it was designed to be about the crowds. It was a time when there was a tremendous fascination with crowds. Ortega has just written Revolt of the Masses. We had Busby Berkeley's choreography. There were Frank Capra's films, American Madness and Meet John Doe. It was the fair of the future, really the world of tomorrow. And the scientific, technological, and human ingenuity was at its peak. There was boundless belief in the American business and industry, and there was a sense in peace of freedom and in the potential of Americans to rise above difficulties. The fair really sought to demonstrate an American way of living. There were dramatic exhibits incorporating the latest display techniques. In fact, Futurama still remains one of the greats. Norman Bell Geddes designed it for General Motors. It was the most extravagant, visionary, multimedia educational entertainment ever built. It was the homage to the highway. Visitors waited in line for 2 hours. They took their place in these high, comfortable chairs, and they sat on a simulated airplane ride over American landscape of 1960, which featured express highways, radio-controlled cars, massive suspension bridges, and modern high-rises. It was the fair of first, the first television, the first fluorescent lighting, first Kodachrome transparencies in color home movie film. This is 1939. First 3D film, viewed through Polaroid glasses. First nylon, lucite, plexiglass. From an architecture and design point of view, it had a streamlined look. One of the things that comes to mind to me is that the great promise that an environment like this can hold. Video?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
It was a different world by 1964. I couldn't resist that. I had a phone call with somebody on the telephone who mentioned it, and I remembered it so profoundly. And the whole point, even though what I'm talking about is exhibit design, I was so struck by the fact that technology rears its head everywhere, no matter what we're talking about, not just as a tool, but as a prophecy. When we contrast the events between 1939 and 1964, we really get at the heart of how the fairs had differed. It was said about the fair in 1964, the future that 1938 predicted had already happened. The fairgoers of the 60s, probably like us, found it hard to believe that progress had been made since 1939. They felt the genie was out of the bottle. Not everyone had shared the fruits of progress in equal measure. Technology had not solved all problems. Indeed, it had created many new ones, from pollution to radioactive waste, and a whole new machinery of death. It was a conservative fair, quote, put together by old men. The audiences were bombarded with messages about progress and faith and technology, and they couldn't believe it anymore. And I think if there's any message to be given, it's that this fair had nothing to do with where the people were. The 1964-65 World's Fair established the indelible drawing power of technology. This is the IBM Pavilion. It was designed by Eero Saarinen and completed by Roshan Dinkaloo, and it held a groundbreaking exhibition by Charles Eames. It was really a multimedia, if they call it a formidable battery of striking, novel cinematic displays, techniques, and multimedia special effects and slides. Charles Eames had 14 screens canted at polyhedral angles with 9 projectors deluging audiences with rapidly cut sequence of simultaneous images. These new forms of experience emerging from the fair technologies really enabled visitors to gain heightened experiences. This is how they were described: visceral illusions, feelings of depth and dimensionality. They'd never seen this before. Staccato feeling of fragmentation, confusion and irritation from cuts so rapid one cannot follow things, or from information overload from too many screens bombarding one with too much information at once. The fair met with very mixed reviews. It was accused of sensory overload. It was praised for dazzling showmanship. Each event had sparkle, exposing audiences to incredible imagery and experience. If there was one thing that was problematic, it was that this had nothing to do with where the audience was. There was this deep foreboding, subconsciously felt at the time, and the ebullient, even flamboyant mood of the fair seemed to be fun, but it left people feeling empty. A lot of the criticisms of it were it was great, but it felt somehow wrong.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Apartheid is as evil.
Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll.
We believe it's John Lennon who was shot.
Just say no.
That's good idea.
What was interesting to me about that, and thanks, by the way, to Chris Harvey, who may be in the audience from MTV, who let me use this piece, is that you could really see that. You know, if you were back in 1964, you probably wouldn't even be able to read it. The real question comes down to who are our audiences? Where do they come from and how do they read the world? If McLuhan was concerned about the impact of television, we could multiply many times the impact of computer technologies and common usage on how we see the world. The next thing is a poster by April Greiman from the Museum of Modern Art, and it symbolizes for me the profound impact the computer has had on the way we see things. We look around and we find this redefinition of perspective and conventional laws of space, time, everywhere. It's particularly interesting when you look at performance art. The next slide is from Robert Wilson. There are extraordinary images that foreshadow deeper changes in contemporary perspective. He redefines space. He divides it into segments. Events take place at various places on the stage, and the ambiguity really forces the viewer, to revert to a pre-literate mode of understanding, to intuit and personalize, and not intellectualize and rationalize. Is it possible that we may actually be forced to think again? Mickey Friedman, in her Primitivism, talked again about juxtaposition, which is a key thing in any kind of environmental experience, what you see in relation to something else. About scale. Now, the next thing, that's Mathematica. Go on to Primitivism, and then on to Frank Gehry's exhibit at the Walker. I think scale, I mean, the incredible idea of being able to experience architecture in the exhibit rather than looking at a drawing. The next one is also Frank Gehry's exhibit, and I think the last one, the next one is as well. It's a fish. That fish that he talked about yesterday. One of my personal favorite exhibits of recent times is Tokyo Form and Spirit, which unfortunately I didn't see at the Walker. I did see it at IBM Gallery. But creating strong, fresh images is very, very important. I sort of want to end with these little observations from my audience with Paul Sappho, who said a lot of things that impressed me. One of the things that I was really struck by was he talked about when he saw Sputnik. He talked about later being at the Museum of Science and Technology in California and coming home with a piece of mylar from a spacecraft. He said it really got to him because he always thought spacecrafts were tightly compressed electronic equipment. They weren't balloons, and all of a sudden he realized that it was a balloon, not something he thought it was. And this idea that we have to focus on making the strange familiar and the familiar strange is something I think all of us really have to attend to. If there's anything technology can do, it can give us a way to make the exhibit and the technology invisible. Certainly there are a great number of tools and techniques that can serve us. And in fact, what makes our field so exciting is that we learn about new subjects, but we're also learning constantly about new technology. I think what's most challenging is not letting the messages and the gimmicks get in the way, but letting them become a vehicle for something that the viewer can take away with them that's personal and that was special. If you look at performance art, you see all kinds of technologies being used. Strong multidimensional multimedia experiences, sounds and images, delivering multi-image complexity. And nonlinear layering. Layering is the key. Things that our public couldn't understand in 1964 that any 10-year-old kid can relate to today. So when it comes down to it, we exhibit designers face all the same challenges in the world that everybody else does. We have a lot of tools and technologies we can use. It seems like sometimes we're living in the world of too much and too little. Too much to work with, too little understanding of what we are up against, and too little time to do it in. We have to be challenging and we have to create good stories. I think the thought I'd like to leave you with is that we really have an obligation to bring it all together and not to be seduced by the tools and to create strong, memorable images and to remember who we're talking to. Thank you.